Welcome to the first edition of the Tutoring Podcast. It is the 19th of November 2017 and I, Olaf Thorn, am reporting from the autumnal airs of Bristol, England. Today we have a heady topic with which to launch this podcast. Before we launch into it, and it is a complex and difficult subject to cover, I quickly want to say, as this is my first ever podcast, that I am dyslexic, so there will be mistakes when reading the script, and I am not a great fan of speaking in general, but I will do my best. However, that being said, being a fan of the old BBC Radio 4 series, In Our Time, and of many independent media sources, such as James Corbett of thecorbettreport.com, Sargon of Akkad, Jake Morphonius, and many, many others, I wanted to put my love of research into action by starting one of my own. It will be rough, as I learn the craft, but it will be fun to explore whatever comes to mind or pops up in the news. So with no further ado, here's episode 1 of the tutoring. The Chimera Cometh, almost. The Chimera is best known as a monster slain by the Greek hero Bellerophon, but its etymology is the same as that of the Greek word for winter, which ultimately goes back to the Proto-Indo-European word game, or gaim. However, it's commonly thought to be the personification of not just winter, but of storms, volcanoes, and other natural disasters. In that sense, an announcement made by Italian neuroscientist Sergio Canavero about the imminent creation of the first artificial and viable chimera could be seen as a natural disaster or one of humanity's greatest achievements, depending on how you see it. This brings us, quickly, to the more modern use of the term, chimera. It means a person with two sets of DNA, literally, two people fused into a single body. This is not to be confused with conjoined twins, however, which is a completely different phenomenon. There's been a few examples of natural chimeras. One where a woman's womb had different DNA to the rest of her, and a rapist whose penis had different DNA to that swabbed from his mouth. So, let's look at Canavero's announcement. Why am I talking about mythological and biological chimeras? Well, last week, Sergio Canavero and Chinese surgeon Ren Xiaoping announced the first successful head transplant. Yes, that's right. The transplanting of one human head from its original body to another's. Now, it has to be stated that both bodies were 100% dead at the time of the transplant, but it is still a human first. For those of you who have heard of either the extravagant Canavero or the more reserved Ren Xiaoping, this has been something the pair have been moving toward for several years now. However, as you might imagine, the very notion of head transplant raises serious medical, practical, philosophical, and ethical issues. This podcast will cover these one by one. First, a short history of head transplants. The notion and idea of transplants goes back centuries, finding its way into mythology and cautionary tales. After all, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a cautionary tale of the dangers of experimental science. However, as with many other scientific theories, time was required for technology to catch up with those ideas. In 1908, a surgeon from St. Louis, Missouri, created the world's first two-headed dog. In the 1950s, Soviet surgeons managed to repeat this feat and created a two-headed dog who lived for 29 days and could lap water from both heads. Moving to the 1970s, a doctor from Cleveland, Ohio, named Robert White, transplanted whole rhesus monkey heads from one body to another. Apparently the comatose monkeys were able to blink when prodded and bite, but their spinal cords were never reattached and they were euthanized, a polite way of saying killed, soon after. White predicted that a human head transplant would come in the 21st century. That time appears to be edging closer. So the natural question to ask from a practical standpoint is, how would a head transplant work? At its most basic, a head transplant requires a healthy, living head with a disabled or dying body, and a brain-dead patient with an otherwise healthy body. Of course, this reduces things down to bits of body, not people. We'll cover the ethical side of this later, don't worry, because that's by far the most important side of this. Many scientists and surgeons believe a head transplant between two living humans to be impossible, especially to become a single viable organism or chimera. The procedures required are the most complex any surgical team will ever attempt. They will take well over 24 hours to do, and the cost will be over $100 million. To make this possible, a team of 80 surgeons would need to prepare both people, the patient, the one keeping the head, and the brain-dead donor. The long path would begin with viable patients being tested, assessed for compatibility in terms of similar height, weight, shape, blood type, and immunotype. Once permissions have been granted for the use of the brain-dead person's body, the surgery will begin. The donor's body will be propped up into a seated position, ready for his surgical decapitation. Meanwhile, the patient would be anesthetized, then their veins will be pumped with chilly fluids to reduce blood flow to the brain, putting it into a kind of suspended animation. However, this only gives the team just 1 hour to make the transplant before irreversible brain damage occurs. Within this hour, 2 teams will begin operations to remove the heads and place the patients onto the donor's body. First, they will harvest the patient's trachea and esophagus. However, they will not make use of the thyroid gland. Several muscles will be color-coded for their later integration into the patient's own muscles before being sliced. Matching actions will be made to the donor's body. A diamond blade will then sever their spinal cords simultaneously so the heads can be removed. Spinal stumps will then be aligned and then bound together using polyethylene glycol, or PEG for short. This has been proven to allow severed spinal cord cells, which do not normally regrow, to be reattached and to resume some kind of function. It is postulated the use of PEG would bind the patient's spinal cord cells to that of the donors, creating hybrid spinal cord cells to bind the two entities together. Next would be the messy business of attaching various blood vessels and tissues together one by one, followed by the stimulation of blood flow and electrical signals to get the two entities binding to and cooperating as one organism. Initially, machines will be used to regulate blood flow and breathing, while the patient chimera is kept in a coma for around 4 weeks. According to Canavero, the patient will then be tested to make sure they're okay, brought to consciousness, and then will go through physiotherapy to learn to use their new body. This hugely simplifies all of the complex procedures and the millions of things which could go wrong, including the low chance of success and the fact that the new chimera could have Christopher Reeve levels of mobility post-operation. They will also be on anti-rejection medications for the rest of their lives, even if this is a success, and unlike some other transplants, this will be irreversible. One last question in this section. What about the donor? The procedure will kill the donor. It is assumed that the person is already dead, well, brain dead, but they are being kept alive. We must remember that the first ever heart transplant technically killed the donor. the recipient lasted less than a month afterwards too. A head transplant will kill the donor, and medical science is examining how to repair damaged brains and nervous systems. It may be possible that one day, therefore, that such a donor could be revived using other techniques and will therefore not be available for the patient. So the next question is, who would do this and why? This can be broken down into who would do the surgery, who would be the donor, and who would be the patient. Let's start with the surgeons. We have seen two surgeons who are interested in these. Ren Xiaoping has a long history of working on transplants, including a hand transplant in Kentucky, and tests on various animals including mice and monkeys. China has more lax ethical standards when it comes to animal testing and research projects. However, it seems Ren wants this for advancing science. Sergio Canavero, on the other hand, was bullied as a kid and found solace in comic books. It happens to many of us. I was bullied and found solace in fantasy fiction. He's gone on to be a fame-loving, media-using scientist who has a long history of publishing scientific papers and courting controversy with an extravagant lifestyle, including writing a book on how to seduce women. Canavero seems to want the glory. Of course, I could be wrong. It could be for scientific reasons too. Moving on to the donor. Simply put, we have no idea who the donor will be. However, some names are in the frame for the first patient. While Ren has up to a dozen Chinese patients who are possible, the most famous patient is a 31-year-old Russian entrepreneur called Valery Spiridonov. He suffers with a fatal muscle wasting condition called Wernicke-Hoffmann disease. Spiridonov has not walked since he was a toddler and is unable to do anything from the neck down except flip a joystick. It's natural when in such a condition to consider a separation between head and body, to see the two as separate. The body is functional and the brain is intellectual spiritual. If the body withers, the head can be transplanted from his point of view. He's no fool though. As he stated many times, he's not willing to pay for an expensive form of euthanasia. He wants some kind of certainty of success, to see it work on other animals at least, before he commits to being a trial subject. He wants to live, to be able to walk, to ride a motorbike, and to do the things he's currently unable to do. In his mind, a new body is the only way for this to happen. As a result, Spiridonov sees identity purely as the head and not the body. So this ultimately leads to the biggest philosophical biological question of all. Who would this person be post-operation?